Hello class, today we're going to be talking about writing language tests and we're going to focus specifically on test specifications. So, how do we write language tests? The process is very simple. It starts with the test specifications. That means the formula or the recipe or the blueprint for the test. The second obvious step is writing the test item. That means all of the questions that constitute the body of the test. The third step will be piloting the items, and in this case we're going to analyze the validity, reliability, and we're going to perform a statistical analysis of all the results as well as specific item analysis to make sure that the items work the way that we want them to work. The next step are the revisions. We are going to correct or fix all of those problems that are indicated by the results of our analysis, and then of course we're going to put the items in a bank, that means in storage, so that we can use them later for different versions of the test or for subsequent administrations of the same test. Finally, we will administer the test. And of course, after test administration, we have to perform the same kind of analysis that we mentioned before, because we need to make sure that the exam is constantly improved. We need this process is cyclical. We're always going to be looking back at the different points so that we can make sure that our test is valid, is reliable, and in general is useful. Now, the first step, as we said, is related to test specifications and construct validity. So in this case, the first thing that we need to do is to produce the specifications. That means the general instructions on how to design the test. And of course, the most important thing at this point is to make sure that the theoretical model that we design or the construct really measures the ability that we want to measure. Now, if we remember, construct validity refers to the extent to which we can interpret a given test score as an indicator of the abilities or construct that we want to measure. Of course, this implies that we need to make sure that the task in the test resemble the domain of generalization. That means the activities that the test takers are going to perform in real life. Having said that, it turns out that the first step is to construct a model of competence, in this case of course proficiency, according to the theory that we have available. That means the common European framework of reference and all of the documents that have available about the course, such as the curriculum or the course syllabus. The construct that we design has to illustrate what the test taker should be able to do in a real target language use domain. That means the model, the construct shows what we want the students to be able to do at the end, because that is the thing that we are going to test. Illustrate this with a little example. What if I wanted to design a test for this course that I'm teaching you? Well, the first thing that I will do is I will ask myself the following question. What is the thing that I want to measure? In other words, what is the characteristic that I want to assess? And of course, the answer will be testing ability. I want you to be able to design, to administer, and to analyze and interpret the results of language tests, because this is something that you will use in your professional life. Now, this ability is made up of at least 3 components. First of all, understanding theory. Before you can administer, design, analyze the results of tests, you will need to understand the theory related to evaluation, assessment, and testing. The second component is explaining the theory. Not only should you be able to understand the concepts, but you should be able to explain them, to analyze, to compare, and to contrast them. The last component that I see is applying the theory, because If you understand and you can explain the theories, that is very good. But what I want you at the end is for you to be able to apply this theory into real life tasks that you're going to face in your professional life as language teaching professionals. Now, I have a construct and I have the components of this construct, but I have a very important part that I still need to think about, and this is called the operationalization of the construct. This means that now I need to find test tasks or test items or test questions, whatever you want to call them, that show me that you can understand, that you can explain, and that you can apply the theory. So for the first one, I could use a matching task. I can ask you to match a concept with its definition, and this will show me that you can understand the theory. There are some other similar ones, such as relating, selecting information, or completing information. If I want to talk about explaining the theory, I can ask you to list, for example, list the elements of test usefulness. I can also ask you to define a certain concept or to explain the difference between something or the other, or compare or contrast different concepts. So now, I want to go back to this part that I call the operationalization of the construct. These are activities, these are tasks that you will do that will demonstrate that you have testing ability. For applying the theory, of course, I can ask you to describe something, to revise some test items or some scales. I can ask you to correct some errors in some test items or in some scales. And I can ask you to design or to validate an instrument. So, this is what we call, ladies and gentlemen, a theoretical construct. Testing ability, what is it? It's understanding theory, explaining theory, applying the theory. How can I see if the person can understand, explain, and apply? By asking them to do those different operations that will demonstrate that they can understand, explain, and apply the theory. This is then a construct of testing language ability. Summarizing then, a construct refers to the abstract model of the characteristic, the concept, the ability, the competence that we want to measure. This trait or this construct is normally complex, and it contains different components that we must identify if we want to assess them. And finally, these components have to be translated into concrete actions or behaviors that we can observe and measure. And this is what we call the operationalization of a construct. When we design test tasks, test items that can help us to measure a complex, abstract, mental concept. This is one example from the explanation that I gave you before about my test. So this is one of the tasks that I ask in my test. I'm going to read the instructions. Look at the following sample test tasks and then describe each test as objective or subjective, direct or indirect, and discrete point or integrated. So if you see here, I am asking you to describe, and I'm using some elements of testing: objective versus subjective, direct versus indirect, and discrete points of integrate or integrated. So in this case, you need to look at the task, and then based on what the task is about, this is a sample from the test of spoken English, the TSE. And if you see, the test task consists in looking at the pictures and telling a story. So if I ask you to describe the test task, you should be able to do the following. You will say, First of all, the task consists in telling a story. So every test taker is going to have a different version of the same story because they are telling the story in their own words. So in this case, there will be different possible kinds of answers. For this reason, the test will be subjective. A subjective test is one in which there is more than one possible correct answer. Concerning the distinction between direct or indirect tasks, we can see, of course, that the task is asking test takers to tell a story. So the question that we need to ask is telling a story part of real language use? Do we tell stories in real life? And of course, the answer is yes. So in this case, we can say that the task is direct because it requires from test taker the same kind of activity that they would do in real life. So the task is direct. And finally, of course, concerning the discrete point or integrative characteristic, we can say by the same token that if the test takers are required to tell a story in order to be able to complete the task, they will need to use different kinds of elements. That means they need vocabulary, they need grammar, they need to know the structure of a story, so this is discourse competence, they need sociolinguistic competence, they need a lot of different language elements, and therefore the task is integrative because it is testing different elements and not just one. So, if you are able to carry out this task in my test, you are demonstrating that you can, of course, apply the theory that you saw in the course. But if you see, I am asking you to do something concrete, and when you do this task, you show me if you have testing ability or not. To designing language tests, we need to look at the construct of communicative competence as is defined by the Common European Framework of Reference. And although there are many competences to be tested in this model, depending on the kind of course, depending on the objectives, depending on the kind of test that you are going to design, you will select some of the elements that you are interested in testing. And of course, something important that I need to mention is that in this case, we only have the basic competences, but the construct is not yet operationalized. In other words, we need to look for activities that help us to test the things that we want to test. If I look at the example of fluency, fluency is an element of phonological competence, which is part of linguistic competence, which is part of communicative competence. But if I want to design a test, I need to think of an activity, a test task, a test item, something that the test taker does that shows me that he or she is fluent. So we need to operationalize the construct. So every time that we're going to design a language test, we need to look at the model of communicative competence and ask ourselves these three basic questions. Number one, what are the competences that I want to test? Number two, what other abstract elements will come into play when I design my exam? And finally, and most importantly, how can the competences that I'm targeting should be made visible? How am I going to operationalize my construct? A second important element that we need to take into account in the early stages of test design when we're setting down the specifications is content validity, which is defined as the extent to which the test measures the content that it intends to measure. So, as you can see, while construct validity is concerned with the ability that we want to measure, content validity is related to the content of the test itself. And in this case, the course syllabus is the reference for the content to be tested, assuming of course that this content was covered completely in class. When we design a test, it is also very important to look at the content, and in this case, we need to look at the Common European Framework of Reference to see what is the specific language content that we need to include in our test. In other words, what grammar, what vocabulary, what communicative functions, what topics we need to include which are relevant for the kind of students that we're testing. Another important source of information will be our course textbooks and programs. And of course, in this case, we need to ask ourselves 3 very important questions. Number 1, what is the content to be tested? Number 2, how have students been working and practicing? And finally, what is expected from them at the end of the course? Looking at these very important sources of information will guarantee that our test has content validity. If we follow the steps very carefully, we will achieve 3 kinds of validity. First of all, our test will have construct validity. This means that the scores that the students obtain in the test will correspond to the abilities the way they occur in real life. Secondly, if we assess the content that is relevant, that is specified, that was covered in class, our test will also have content validity. And finally, because the students will see that their scores correspond to the real abilities, and if they see that the content that you tested is the content that you included in your courses, they will achieve, or they will see that your test also has face validity. That means the students will accept the results even if they're not happy with them, because they will know that the scores of your tests are fair. So, once we have made decisions about the construct and the content of the test, we are ready to design our test specifications. Test specifications, ladies and gentlemen, refers to the official statement of what the test tests and how we test it. In other words, it is the blueprint or the recipe or the instructions for the test writers and the item writers. So people who are going to participate in the design of the test will know exactly what they need to do, because there are some very detailed descriptions of what the test is going to include. The following are the elements that we need to include in test specifications. First of all, of course, very importantly, we must specify the purpose of the test. Is it an achievement test? Is it a placement test? Is it a diagnostic test? Is it a proficiency test? The second element is the test taker's profile. We must provide an extensive and detailed description of who the test takers are, their age, the level of proficiency, the kind of experiences that they will go through, all of the information that we can find about the people who will take the test. The third element is the number and length of sections in the test. We need to specify beforehand how many sections and what kind of sections the exam is going to made up of. The next element is the target language situation, which refers to the different domains in which the students will need to use the language outside of the test itself in real life. The next element is the text types, and in this case we must explain what are the kind of texts and what are the types of recordings that will be included for the reading comprehension and the listening comprehension sections of the test. The next element, of course, are the language skills. What are the language skills that we are going to test? Oral interaction, oral production, speaking, listening, reading, writing. The next element are the language elements, and in this case, this refers to the content. If we're talking about grammar, because we're going to test grammar, in this case we need to specify what are specifically the language, the grammar points that are going to be included in the test. If we're going to evaluate vocabulary, then what are the specific words, the specific expressions that we're going to include in our test, and so on and so forth. The next elements are the kinds of tasks. In this case, we will decide if our tasks are going to be discrete point or integrative, if they're going to be direct or indirect, if they're going to be objective or subjective. The next element in the test specification is the number and weight of items per section, and in this case we need to see exactly how the test is going to be organized and what are the sections or the kinds of items that are going to get or that are going to give more points to the test takers. The next one is the test method, and in this case, of course, we're going to be talking about the specific tasks that the students will do. So, is our test going to include multiple choice, fill in the blanks, short answer, and all of those kinds of items? The next element, of course, we need to make sure that every section of the test has specific directions and even examples of how the students have to answer to the different items. Finally, we're going to give the scoring criteria, and in this case we mean if we're going to use a scoring rubric, we need to provide it. We need to explain the ways in which the test is going to be scored and what are the procedures that we're going to take for analyzing and calculating the results. So this refers to, is the test going to be norm-referenced or criterion referenced? Are some sections going to be scored in an objective or a subjective way? And what are the elements that the scorers, that the testers are going to use in order to decide if an answer is correct or incorrect? I want to make a final distinction between test specifications and test syllabus. First of all, test specifications, ladies and gentlemen, refers to a detailed document that is only for internal purposes and that is going to be used only by test developers and evaluators. The second kind of document, a syllabus, is a simplified document. It's public, everybody can see it, and this document can be used by teachers and students who wish to prepare for the test, by decision makers, and of course by test book publishers. So the test specifications are for test constructors, test editors, the ones who correct the test, test validators, the ones who check the items and make sure that they are valid and reliable, by test users, of course, when they require them, by textbook publishers, because sometimes they need to create materials so that people can prepare for the test. So, we have looked at one of the most important steps in test design, test specifications. Thanks a lot for your attention. If you have any questions, remember you can send them directly to the classroom group, or you can write to me in the Facebook group that we just created. Thanks a lot and good luck with your tasks.